Under the pale autumn sky of Madison's industrial fringe, the Northway Coils factory stood like a survivor from another century, its red brick walls weathered by decades of rain and smoke, its chimneys long dormant, yet still looming with an austere dignity that reminded everyone who passed that there had once been a time when small family-owned plants drove the heart of America's towns. Wayne Collins inherited the place not because he wanted to be an entrepreneur, but because his father and older brothers had built it with their own hands, and when they were gone, he could not bring himself to let it rot into nothing. He had grown up running between those aisles of humming machines, the smell of copper and oil embedded in his memory, and when the responsibility fell on him, he accepted it without ceremony, not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. The neighborhood around the factory had changed over the years, transformed from a mixed industrial belt into a hybrid zone of housing developments and strip malls, the kind of terrain where homeowners associations crept into authority far beyond their original purpose. Northway Coils, though technically standing on a parcel within the jurisdiction of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, had always been an anomaly, tolerated rather than embraced. Old agreements allowed Wayne to pay minimal infrastructure fees, and as long as the factory kept its noise down and smoke contained, the board left him alone. That uneasy truce was as much a relic of the past as the factory itself. Wayne was no visionary mogul. He was a pragmatist who spent his mornings in worn coveralls, sleeves rolled up, troubleshooting aging lathes and rewiring motors that were twice as old as some of his workers. He had watched competitors either modernize into sleek robotics or collapse entirely, yet he stubbornly held on, insisting there was still value in producing coils the old-fashioned way, with steel that had weight and machines that left sweat on a man's brow. Customers dwindled, contracts shrank, but he kept the doors open, refusing to let his family's legacy be erased by convenience or cheap overseas imports. In town, some admired his tenacity, but others whispered that Collins was dragging a corpse around, wasting land that could be put to better use, obstructing the progress of redevelopment. The factory's neighborhood no longer smelled of iron or grease. It smelled of fresh paint, new asphalt, and synthetic lawns laid down by developers who bought up old lots one by one. For years, Wayne ignored the murmurs of transformation, focusing on his machines and on the handful of employees who still believed in him. But the pressure was palpable. Every time he passed the HOA office, a sterile glass building that looked like a bank, he felt eyes on him, as if his very presence was a stubborn reminder of something they wanted gone. It was not hostility in words, at least not openly, but in the way neighbors crossed the street instead of waving, in the way official envelopes kept appearing in his mailbox, letters filled with polite yet suffocating reminders about community, standards, and safety expectations. Still, Wayne believed he could weather the storm. He had always thought that as long as he paid what was required and kept his head down, the board would leave him be. He did not seek conflict, nor did he enjoy confrontation. He found solace in the predictability of machinery, in the steady rhythm of production, in the dignity of working hands. Even as the HOA grew more powerful, spreading into areas of life no one would have imagined 10 years earlier, he convinced himself they would not care about one stubborn factory, one man refusing to sell his land. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet. On a late October night, when the town was already quiet, a thin plume of smoke rose from the eastern wing of Northway Coils. By the time Wayne arrived, called by a neighbor who had seen the glow from across the freeway, the blaze was beyond control. Fire crews battled through collapsing beams and twisting sheets of metal that shrieked like dying animals. But all they could do was contain the inferno until dawn. Wayne stood behind the tape, the acrid smell burning his lungs, watching the building collapse inward in bursts of sparks. He said nothing, even as officers asked him questions. His voice had deserted him, replaced by the ringing in his ears. The place where his father's handprints still lingered on old walls, where his brother's laughter once filled the shop floor, was reduced to black rubble in a single night, When morning came, the factory was gone, but what unsettled Wayne more than the ash was the silence of the people around him. Some neighbors came to look, standing at a distance as if observing the fall of a monument they had been waiting to see crumble. There was no comfort offered, no solidarity, only the thinly veiled relief of those who saw opportunity in ruins. He drove home with soot on his hands and a void in his chest, telling himself the worst had already happened. But within a week, an official envelope arrived, heavy with embossed seals of the HOA, and in those pages Wayne discovered the truth. The worst had only just begun. Wayne Collins had barely begun to process the loss when the letter arrived, delivered not by a postman in the usual stack of envelopes, but by courier in a stiff cardboard sleeve that looked as though it had been prepared for a ceremony rather than a notice. The seal of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, embossed in metallic green, stared at him like a badge of authority, cold and permanent, as if daring him to believe it was anything but final. He opened it at his kitchen table, surrounded by the silence of a house that had once been filled with the hum of his late father's radio and the clatter of the boots at the door, and read the words again and again, unable to convince himself they were real. The HOA was demanding $3 million in damages, citing irreparable harm to community infrastructure, environmental degradation, and psychological trauma inflicted on neighboring residents. The phrasing was so elaborate, so carefully engineered, that it resembled a manifesto more than a legal document, yet the signature at the bottom was real enough. Wilbert Blake, president of Meadowbrook HOA. At first, Wayne thought it was a grotesque misunderstanding, the kind of clerical overreach that would be corrected with a phone call and a bit of common sense. He called the office, asked to speak to someone in charge, but the receptionist transferred him to a voicemail box that politely thanked him for his concern and promised a reply within 30 business days. When he drove to the office in person, a place that resembled a corporate headquarters more than a neighborhood organization, he was greeted by the sight of his own photograph pinned on a bulletin board in the lobby under the heading Ongoing Cases. The staff treated him not as a man in shock who had lost his livelihood, but as if he were already guilty, a defendant in a trial he had not yet been allowed to attend. The following evening he forced himself to attend a scheduled HOA meeting, thinking that a face-to-face conversation might pierce the fog of absurdity. He sat in the back of the hall, listening to the drone of committee reports about landscaping budgets and security patrols, until Blake called for discussion of the recent incident at Northway Coils. What followed was not discussion, but public condemnation dressed in bureaucratic language. Blake, a tall man with a voice trained in courtroom cadence, declared that Collins had failed to maintain adequate fire suppression measures, that his negligence had endangered the safety of all residents, and that preliminary surveys indicated contamination of soil and groundwater from chemicals stored in the facility. Wayne wanted to object, to explain that the factory had been inspected regularly by the county fire marshal and had passed without citation, but each time he raised his hand, Blake acknowledged him only to say, "Thank you, Mr. Collins. We'll let you respond during your formal hearing," the neighbors murmured, some nodding, others glancing away as if reluctant to meet his eyes. By the time the gavel struck to close the matter, the verdict in the court of the public opinion had already been sealed. Wayne was the villain who had burned his own heritage into the ground. In the days that followed, a subtle campaign of erasure began. Wayne noticed that his name disappeared from the local business directory. The sign that had once pointed toward Northway Coils was quietly removed by a city crew, leaving only bare soil where letters had stood for decades. Even the local newspaper, which once praised his father for providing jobs, printed a sterile article suggesting that questions remain about the safety protocols of the defunct facility. It was not defunct, he thought bitterly. It had been alive. Until fire consumed it. But the language made it sound as though the place had died years ago and he had simply refused to bury it. When Wayne tried to hire an independent investigator to analyze the rubble, he found himself blocked at every turn. Environmental consultants refused the job, citing conflicts of interest without explanation. A fire specialist from another county agreed to meet him, but after their first phone call he sent a curt message withdrawing, saying that his firm had received guidance to avoid involvement. The site itself was cordoned off with fresh fencing and warning signs that proclaimed hazardous zone, entry prohibited by HOA order. Even though Wayne still held the deed to the land, he was told by a uniformed security guard that entry required written authorization from the association. He returned home with the absurd realization that he had been locked out of his own property not by the state or federal government, but by the very homeowners group that once claimed to exist only to regulate lawn heights and holiday decorations. The absurdity deepened when anonymous notices began appearing in his mailbox. They were not official letters, but photocopies of complaints supposedly filed by neighbors. Allegations that his factory had emitted toxic fumes for years, that he had stored flammable materials without permits, that his property had driven down real estate values. One complaint accused him of shouting profanities at children who played near the fence line, something so far from his quiet nature that he almost laughed until he realized how easily such fabrications could be accepted once a man was already branded careless. The HOA had weaponized reputation as effectively as law. Wayne began to piece together fragments of a larger puzzle. At a diner outside town, an old acquaintance from the planning office told him, in a voice lowered to a whisper, that the parcel where Northway Coils stood had been marked on a redevelopment map 2 years ago, long before the fire. The city wanted to attract an energy company interested in building a sleek campus, but the factory was a stubborn obstacle, a reminder of outdated industry that did not fit the marketing brochures. The HOA had quietly lobbied for rezoning, citing long-term safety concerns. Yet because Wayne refused to sell, they could not move forward. The fire, whether accident or design, had changed that calculus overnight. Now they had both a physical void and a villain to fill it with. The thought twisted in his stomach. If the fire was no accident, then someone had decided that his family's history, his livelihood, his workers' jobs were worth less than the promise of a glossy development. But he had no proof, only suspicion. And suspicion was not enough in a world where official papers carried the weight of truth. He stared again at the demand for $3 million, realizing with horror that it was not merely an absurd number meant to frighten him. It was a strategy, to bury him under debt so crushing that he would have no choice but to relinquish his land, to surrender what fire had not already consumed. Wayne stood at the edge of his ruined factory one evening, slipping through a gap in the fence before the guards made their rounds, and gazed at the blackened beams jutting like broken ribs against the sky. He touched the ground, scooping a handful of ash into his palm, and felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, as if the soil itself had turned against him. The machines were gone, the legacy reduced to cinders, yet the real danger was not the fire, but the narrative now spreading like smoke through every corner of the neighborhood. That he had been careless, that he had been dangerous, that he was already guilty. As the wind carried the ash from his hand, he understood with cold clarity that the fire had been only the beginning. The true battle would be fought in courts, in boardrooms, and in whispered rumors across fences, and he was already the losing side in a game he had never agreed to play. The first escalation came not with flames or ash, but with papers, pages stamped and stapled, pushed under Wayne Collins' door as if the law itself had grown impatient to devour him. He had assumed, or perhaps forced himself to assume, that after the initial shock of the demand, the association would retreat into silence until the matter wound its way through the slow machinery of courts. Instead, each week brought a new envelope, thicker than the last, filled with legalistic accusations written in a tone of mechanical certainty, as if guilt were not something to be proven, but something already settled. The documents spoke of negligence, of environmental recklessness, of willful disregard for the safety of the community, a word repeated so often that it became a cudgel rather than a comfort. They demanded that he submit financial disclosures, that he agree to arbitration, that he acknowledge liability in advance of trial. He stared at the language and felt the walls of his modest kitchen press closer with every paragraph. When he tried to hire a lawyer, doors closed one after another. Firms that had once taken his calls suddenly informed him they were unable to assist due to prior commitments. A young attorney in a strip mall office listened politely for 15 minutes before excusing himself to check something, and never returning, leaving Wayne alone in the conference room until the receptionist awkwardly told him that the office was closing. It became clear that the association, with its sprawling network of contracts and influence, had already ensured that few would risk siding against them. They were not merely neighbors with a charter, they had become an arm of power, able to squeeze silence from those who might have spoken. The financial blows began to land in tandem. A letter from his bank informed him that his credit line was suspended pending resolution of outstanding liabilities. An insurance representative, once friendly, now spoke in clipped tones about policy exclusions that nullified coverage for the fire, citing clauses Wayne had never seen in his contracts. Even his utilities grew erratic. Sudden inspections that forced temporary shutoffs, errors in billing that left him overcharged, all of it a slow erosion of stability. It was as though invisible hands were tightening a noose, not fast enough to draw blood, but steadily enough that each breath became more labored. One evening, determined not to surrender without resistance, Wayne returned to the ruins of his factory, flashlight in hand, slipping through the same gap in the fence. The site had grown more desolate with each passing day, weeds pushing through cracks in the scorched concrete, graffiti appearing on the surviving walls. He crouched among the rubble and noticed something that had nagged at him before, but now stood undeniable. The fire had burned unevenly. Entire rows of machines had been reduced to molten lumps, yet adjacent storage areas remained oddly untouched, as though the flames had followed a deliberate path rather than spreading at random. He found a melted barrel that had once contained only solvent for cleaning, yet the soil around it bore streaks of residue inconsistent with its usual use. He bent closer, inhaling the faint, acrid odor, and felt a chill despite the summer air. It was not proof, not yet, but it suggested that accelerants had been used, accelerants foreign to his facility. He photographed what he could with an old digital camera, uncertain whether the images would mean anything in court, yet desperate to preserve what little remained before it was buried under official reports. As he left, the beam of his flashlight caught a sign recently bolted to the fencing. Property under investigation. Trespassing subject to criminal charges. The wording had changed. Before, it had been framed as a safety measure. Now it was framed as criminality. They were not only taking his land, they were rewriting the law so that his presence upon it became illegal. The psychological pressure mounted in subtler ways. Neighbors he had known for years no longer nodded when he passed. Some crossed the street to avoid him. In the grocery store line he overheard whispered fragments. Dangerous chemicals. Reckless. Lawsuit. A child once waved at him while riding his bike, only to be yanked away by a mother who shot Wayne a glare that mixed fear with disdain. He realized he had been recast in their eyes, no longer the stubborn craftsman who refused to abandon his father's trade, but the man who had endangered their property values, their children, their peace of mind. Reputation, once cracked, shattered quickly. Yet the most crushing moment came during a mandatory HOA assembly where he was compelled to answer preliminary inquiries. The meeting was held in the sleek community hall, with rows of residents seated as though attending a performance rather than a hearing. Blake presided from the front, gavel poised, voice smooth as polished stone. He presented a series of evidence exhibits, photographs of rusted drums, invoices for solvents, diagrams of the factory's outdated wiring. Wayne attempted to explain, to remind them that the drums had been empty for years, that the wiring had been inspected, that no official citation had ever been issued, but Blake cut him off repeatedly, declaring his responses non-responsive, or irrelevant. The audience murmured with each interruption, the mood turning more hostile with every word. By the time Wayne sat down, his face flushed and his fists clenched beneath the table, the verdict was unspoken but clear. He had already been condemned. Later that night he sat in his darkened living room, surrounded by stacks of papers he barely understood, and contemplated the trajectory of his life. The fire had destroyed steel and brick, but what followed was more insidious. A campaign to erase him from his own story, to brand him as careless so that others could profit. The realization grew heavier with each sleepless hour. This was not negligence on his part. It was design on theirs. They had found a way to turn disaster into opportunity, to transform ash into a weapon, and they would wield it until he was broken. The first escalation was complete. He was not only fighting for his factory, he was fighting for the right to exist without being rewritten as the villain of a narrative he did not author. Wayne Collins had learned to live in the rhythm of harassment. A new envelope every few days, a cold look in the grocery store, another notice tacked to his door, another whispered comment overheard and left unanswered. He thought perhaps he had grown numb, that the pressure could grind him down only so far before he simply ceased to react. But the turning point arrived when he began to notice patterns in the chaos, strands of logic beneath the noise that suggested. A deliberate hand arranging every blow. The realization came not as a sudden spark, but as a slow burn, igniting across weeks of gathering fragments and half-truths, until he found himself staring at a picture too large to dismiss and too dangerous to ignore. It began with the discovery of documents at the county recorder's office. He had gone there in frustration, hoping to find something, anything, that might support his claim that the HOA's demand was baseless. He expected boredom, the dusty slog of public records, but what he unearthed shook him with the cold certainty of conspiracy. Buried among zoning requests and development plans was a map stamped with the county seal and dated 2 years earlier, long before the fire had gutted his factory. The map outlined a redevelopment initiative labeled East Meadowbrook Revitalization Corridor. His parcel, clearly marked, had been shaded in red as a future acquisition zone. The note beside it did not describe his land as private industrial property, but as designated transition lot, pending clearance. The phrasing was sterile, bureaucratic, but Wayne knew what it meant. They had already planned for his land to vanish, long before any spark touched his walls. He pressed further. Through a sympathetic clerk willing to stretch protocol, Wayne obtained copies of meeting notes from a closed HOA board session. In them, Wilbert Blake had spoken of unlocking potential through strategic redevelopment and resolving legacy obstructions. The term obstructions chilled Wayne more than the demand for millions ever had. He was not a neighbor in their eyes, not even a stubborn holdout, but an obstruction, a block of matter to be removed from the path of profit. The fire had not been an accident in their narrative. It had been a gift, a mechanism to accelerate a process already in motion. The true confirmation came in a form Wayne never anticipated. One night, while nursing black coffee at the same diner where he had once met his informant from the planning office, he noticed an elderly man seated 2 booths away, his hands trembling as he fumbled with papers that slid to the floor. Wayne bent to help, returning the scattered sheets, and caught sight of the HOA letterhead at the top of each. The man introduced himself as Henry Lowell, a retired surveyor who had once contracted with the association. His voice was brittle, his eyes watery with age, but his words carried a precision that could not be mistaken. "I remember your parcel," he said softly, leaning across the table. "They had me redraw boundaries 3 times, each time a little smaller, A little less yours, a little more theirs. I told Blake it wasn't right, but he said it was just preliminary. They don't erase land all at once, Mr. Collins. They shrink it until you don't recognize it anymore. Wayne listened in silence as Lowell described how maps had been altered, how easements had been shifted, how the language of property lines could be bent until even a deed seemed flimsy. The fire, Lowell suggested, had been the final piece, the catalyst that allowed the HOA to claim that Wayne's property was not only unsafe, but illegitimate. You need to watch them, the old man warned, his hand trembling against the cup. They don't fight you in daylight. They fight you in the margins of paper, in signatures no one remembers signing, in words no one bothers to read. Before Wayne could ask more, the man gathered his papers and shuffled out, leaving behind only the faint smell of ink and tobacco, and the weight of revelation. Armed with this new perspective, Wayne sought allies outside the HOA's reach. He traveled to a university 2 towns over and managed to speak with a professor of environmental engineering who had studied urban redevelopment cases. The professor, a meticulous woman named Dr. Rivera, examined the limited samples Wayne had collected from the rubble and frowned. She explained that the residues did not match the typical solvents stored in small factories, but rather resembled compounds used in industrial demolition, a kind of accelerant designed to burn hot and fast, often employed when clearing condemned buildings. Her words landed with a heavy clarity. Someone had seeded his factory with chemicals meant not to sustain production, but to guarantee destruction. The revelation changed Wayne's grief into rage, yet it also gave him the first taste of strategy. He realized he could no longer defend himself by denying negligence. He would have to attack by proving design. The HOA had assumed he would fold, overwhelmed by debt and shame, but if he could show deliberate sabotage, the narrative would reverse. Blake's careful rhetoric of community safety would collapse under the weight of fraud. The challenge was evidence. Rumors and suspicions were insufficient. Courts demanded tangible proof. That proof arrived in a cruel twist of irony. Wayne received a package one morning. No return address, the handwriting jagged and unfamiliar. Inside lay a USB drive and a single note scrawled in pencil. You didn't burn it. He did, against his better judgment. Wayne plugged the drive into his computer, half expecting a virus, but what appeared was a series of time-stamped photographs. The images were grainy but clear enough. A figure entering the factory grounds at night carrying containers, the faint glint of liquid pouring across concrete. In the last frame, the man's face turned toward the camera, caught in the glow of a streetlight. It was Wilbert Blake. Wayne sat frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The HOA president, the man who had denounced him in public, the man who demanded millions, had been photographed staging the very fire he blamed on negligence. The implications staggered him. If he released the images, he risked exposure, retaliation, perhaps even violence. Yet if he kept them hidden, he would remain the scapegoat. The note had no explanation, no indication of who had taken the pictures, only the promise that Wayne had not imagined his suspicions. For the first time since the fire, he felt something other than despair. He felt the tremor of power shifting, the fragile spark of leverage. That night, Wayne returned once more to the ruins, standing beneath the fractured silhouette of what had once been his father's pride. The air smelled of char and rust, but in his pocket rested the drive that might turn the tide. He stared across the fence toward the gleaming houses of the neighborhood, their windows lit with comfort, and understood that his battle was not just about bricks or machines. It was about erasure and survival, about refusing to be rewritten out of existence. The middle point had been reached, the threshold where grief hardened into defiance. He whispered to the night, to the ghosts of his family, to the ashes beneath his feet. They think I'm finished. But this is where it begins. The days after Wayne discovered the photographs were a blur of adrenaline and fear. a strange mixture that left him unable to rest, yet unwilling to stop moving. He carried the USB drive with him everywhere, hidden first in his jacket, then in the lining of an old toolbox, then buried under loose floorboards in his bedroom, as though the simple act of possession placed him in constant danger. Each time he left the house, he looked twice over his shoulder, convinced that someone knew he had evidence, that someone was waiting for him to make the mistake of exposing it prematurely. Yet he also understood that silence was no longer an option. The photographs were not merely insurance, they were a weapon, and weapons were only useful when wielded. The next hearing in the HOA's civil suit was scheduled in a crowded downtown courthouse, and Wayne walked into the building with the drive in his pocket, prepared to use it if the moment arose. The chamber was filled with residents, reporters from local outlets, and the polished attorneys hired by the association. Wilbert Blake sat at the front like a monarch on a throne, his composure unshaken, his voice smooth as he described the long-standing safety violations that had allegedly doomed Northway Coils. Wayne tried to follow procedure, to wait for his turn, but rage burned too hot in his chest. When he finally rose to speak, his voice cracked not with weakness but with restrained fury. He told the court that he possessed evidence proving that Blake himself had been present at the site before the fire, that the narrative of negligence was a fabrication designed to cover a deliberate act of sabotage. Gasps rippled through the audience, but Blake merely raised an eyebrow, smiling as if he had rehearsed for this very accusation. "Mr. Collins," he said, his tone patronizing, "wild claims will not absolve you of responsibility." The judge demanded proof, but Wayne hesitated. To reveal the photographs here, without authentication, would risk dismissal as forgery, and Blake's attorneys would bury him under technicalities. He left the courtroom with murmurs buzzing in his ears, feeling the sting of both triumph and defeat. Triumph because he had finally spoken truth aloud, defeat because it had not yet mattered. That night, Wayne's phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly, but the words were edged with menace. "You don't know who gave you those pictures, and you don't know what they want from you. If I were you, I'd put them back in the dirt where you found them and walk away." The call ended before Wayne could respond. His hands shook as he set the receiver down, his mind spiraling. Whoever had slipped him the photographs was not a savior, but a participant in a larger game, and Wayne was just the piece being moved forward to test Blake's defenses. The following days brought a new kind of warfare. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes around the neighborhood, accusing Wayne of forging documents, of creating doctored images to smear Blake. Social media accounts, many obviously fake, circulated rumors that Wayne had been seen purchasing chemicals weeks before the fire. A petition began circulating to have him barred from attending further HOA meetings on the grounds that his hostile presence endangered the community. He watched from his kitchen window as a pair of young men stapled one of the flyers to a telephone pole across the street, laughing as they did so. The isolation deepened into something suffocating, a cage of perception he could not break. Yet Wayne pressed forward. He arranged a meeting with Dr. Rivera, the environmental engineer, and showed her the photographs. She studied them carefully, noting timestamps and environmental details that confirmed their plausibility. "If you want this to matter," she told him, "you need chain of custody. You need corroboration. Right now, these are just pictures on a drive. But if we can match the chemical residues I tested with the containers in his hands, you have a narrative that will hold." Wayne clung to her words like a lifeline, knowing that science might accomplish what outrage could not. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated on its own terms. Blake filed a motion for an emergency lien against Wayne's remaining assets, claiming he was deliberately attempting to conceal funds that could satisfy the $3 million claim. The court approved a freeze on his bank accounts, leaving him with only the cash he had hidden at home. Bills piled on the table, notices stacked by the door. At night he dreamed of fire not as flame but as paper, endless sheets of accusations smothering him until he could no longer breathe. The turning point came when Wayne received another anonymous package, this time containing not photographs but internal emails from the association's insurance broker. The correspondence was blunt, almost arrogant, discussing how Blake had secured a dramatic increase in coverage for community infrastructure only days before the fire, and how the payout would more than offset liabilities. Reading those words, Wayne felt his stomach twist with equal parts horror and vindication. It was not simply malice against him. It was profit, raw and unapologetic, disguised as disaster. Blake had turned fire into currency, and the HOA had become his accomplice. Armed with this new evidence, Wayne returned to court once more, not with desperation but with the slow-burning resolve of a man who knew he had been underestimated. He did not present the photographs yet, not until Rivera could finish her analysis, but he submitted the emails into the record, forcing Blake's attorneys to scramble. For the first time, Wayne saw a flicker of unease cross Blake's face, a tiny crack in the polished mask. It was not victory, not yet, but it was momentum. As Wayne left the courthouse that day, he felt the weight of eyes on him, not only hostile, but calculating. He understood now that he was not just resisting an unjust claim. He was unraveling a scheme far larger than his ruined factory. The second escalation had revealed the true stakes, not whether he had been negligent, but whether truth itself could survive against those who profited from its erasure. He walked into the fading light with his jaw set and his fists clenched, ready for the next strike, knowing it would come soon, and knowing he would no longer face it as prey but as a man determined to fight back. The courtroom on the morning of the climactic hearing felt less like a place of law than a theater prepared for the unveiling of a long-anticipated play. Every bench filled with residents who whispered behind cupped hands, reporters crowding the aisles with cameras slung at their sides, and at the center of it all, Wilbert Blake seated with his attorneys, exuding a confidence so controlled it seemed rehearsed. Wayne Collins walked in not as a man beaten but as someone carrying the heavy certainty of truth, though he knew truth by itself was fragile unless anchored with proof. He carried with him two things: the authenticated analysis from Dr. Rivera linking the accelerant residues at the site to the very compounds Blake had been documented handling in the photographs, and the emails that demonstrated not only foreknowledge but profit, insurance payouts that turned tragedy into calculated revenue. When called to speak, Wayne's voice no longer cracked with frustration. It was steady, almost cold, as he described how his family's factory had been marked for erasure years before the fire, how boundaries had been redrawn without his consent, how every accusation of negligence had been a mask to hide a deliberate cleansing. Then he produced the photographs, now authenticated with metadata and chemical correlation, projecting them onto the courtroom screen so that every resident, every reporter, and every juror could see Blake's face illuminated by the glow of his own crime. Gasps filled the chamber, the sound of an audience recognizing betrayal not just of one man but of an entire community that had trusted its leader. Blake shifted in his seat for the first time, and, though he attempted to maintain composure, the thin line of sweat at his temple betrayed the collapse of certainty. The prosecution of Wayne evaporated within minutes. The judge, who had once treated him with barely concealed skepticism, now leaned forward, scrutinizing Blake's attorneys as they fumbled to object on technical grounds, their voices suddenly brittle. But the emails sealed the matter. Explicit references to the insurance adjustment, the timing of the policy increase, and the projected payout that aligned almost perfectly with the damages claimed. The pattern was undeniable, a scheme constructed with arrogance and executed with fire. Reporters scribbled furiously as the judge declared that not only would the civil claims against Wayne be dismissed with prejudice, but that the matter would be referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution of Wilbert Blake on charges of arson, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Murmurs erupted like thunder through the hall, neighbors turning to one another in shock, some in shame, as if realizing how quickly they had allowed themselves to condemn a man who had only tried to preserve his legacy. Wayne sat quietly, hands folded, staring not at Blake but at the floor, as though the weight of vindication was almost too heavy to lift after months of humiliation. Blake was led from the courtroom not in handcuffs but under escort, his shoulders still squared but his face pale, the mask of authority stripped away. Wayne watched without triumph, only exhaustion, knowing that the fire had already consumed more than any verdict could restore. He had won the battle for truth, but the cost had been years of work reduced to ashes and a reputation scarred by suspicion. Yet, as the gavel struck, marking the end of the hearing, Wayne felt something shift within him, the realization that he had not only defended himself but had exposed the machinery of exploitation that might otherwise have devoured others. For the first time since the night of the fire, he walked outside the courthouse and inhaled air that did not taste of smoke or fear, though it carried the bitter tang of memory. Reporters swarmed him with questions, but he pushed through silently, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of sound bites. His truth had been spoken where it mattered most. The climactic moment had arrived, the narrative rewritten, the predator unmasked. And though his factory lay in ruins, Wayne understood that he had prevented something far greater than personal ruin. He had stopped a machine built to consume lives under the guise of community. When the dust finally settled, Wayne Collins found himself walking through streets that felt both familiar and foreign, the same houses and trimmed hedges lining the neighborhood but carrying an altered silence, as though the community itself had been stunned into reflection by the spectacle of its leader's fall. The HOA, stripped of its authority after Blake's arrest, was placed under temporary state oversight, and for the first time in years the endless stream of letters, fines, and demands ceased. Mailboxes that had once overflowed with threats now carried only the mundane clutter of bills and catalogs, and neighbors who had once avoided his eyes now offered hesitant nods, small gestures of shame mixed with relief, as if unsure whether they were permitted to acknowledge him. Wayne accepted these gestures without bitterness, though not with warmth, for he understood that trust broken so easily could never fully be restored, and he no longer cared to seek validation from those who had allowed him to be cast as a villain. The land where Northway Coils had stood remained fenced, a blackened scar waiting for redevelopment, but Wayne no longer felt compelled to rebuild the factory from ashes. Too much had been lost, and he knew that to chase restoration would be to remain chained to grief. Instead, after long deliberation, he sold the parcel to a university research program that promised to use it as a testing site for fire safety and industrial resilience, a fitting transformation of destruction into knowledge. When the contract was signed, he walked the grounds one final time, touching the charred remains of a wall that had once borne his family's name, and whispered a goodbye not of defeat but of release. On the day the university broke ground, a modest ceremony was held. Wayne stood at the edge of the gathering, not at the podium but in the quiet, and listened as officials spoke of innovation and safety. No one mentioned his suffering. No one spoke of the months of isolation, yet he did not resent the omission. His role was not to be celebrated, but to have endured, and endurance was its own form of victory. As he turned to leave, he felt lighter than he had in years, knowing that he had carried the truth through fire, through lies, and through judgment, and had placed it firmly where it could not be erased. The fight had taken nearly everything, but it had given him the one thing that mattered most, the certainty that when others tried to write him out of existence, he had refused to vanish.